Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I am very excited because I think it's extremely timely to have this gentleman on with us, but we are joined by Phil Mancuso with EPM. For those of you that aren't familiar with him, he's worked in the mortgage industry since 1988. Definitely continues to make it better with his futuristic style of thinking, as well as customer service skills and communication and keeping his word. He believes that 1 + 1 doesn't always have to equal 2. Maybe we can think outside of the box and come up with something that only people have dreamed of. Today, he is the president, chief investment officer, and partner at EPM. More gets done with Phil than without him, and EPM and all of his other partners, NAM included, are grateful for his leadership every day. So welcome, Phil.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're just going to get it kicked off. This is going to be a what I call a fireside chat without a fire. So a lot is going on economically, and we're about to enter into or getting close to entering into the last quarter of 2025. So I'm just going to start asking you some questions. So with regards to basically like the current economic landscape and market conditions, what is your overall assessment of where we stand economically right now? And what key indicators are you watching more closely as we head into these final months of 2025?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, by the way. And I mean, it is pretty timely coming out of Jackson Hole last week, and some of the comments that Fed Chairman Powell had on Friday, giving some folks in the industry some renewed optimism about the potential downward trajectory of interest rates, which is a highly focused on and controversial topic right now because people are split on where we're going to land. From a broad economic perspective, to specifically answer your question, I believe that we're significantly challenged as an economy, both domestically and globally. What one of the things I think that you learn in business and in the markets is sometimes unintended consequences. And the unintended consequences of the COVID stimulus, particularly this, and some of this is fact, some of this is fact, but my opinion, which is fact. Some of the unintended consequences of this second round of stimulus, and I think that that's really what we're battling here, was summer 22. When folks were getting those $1,000, $1,400 checks, I think that what the government didn't contemplate was, what are they going to do with this money? And I think that for the average American, given where we were at that moment in time, $1,400 was such sort of an inconsequential amount of money, right? It maybe helped them make ends meet, or maybe it didn't, or maybe it was, okay, great, I love this 1,500 bucks in my pocket, but it doesn't really change my life. And if it does for more than a week, I think what we saw was a lot of people went out and blew the money. In fact, most people did, right? So now, when you look at history, and by the way, I mean, we don't have enough time to have this conversation, so I'm going to try to condense it as best I can. But when you look at the Federal Reserve and their involvement in the booms and the busts, their involvement in dictating so-called monetary policy, the reason why it's worked or not worked historically is when you print money, you give the economy the money to spend. Therefore, it creates jobs and ultimately creates some inflation. And when you take that money away or that leverage away, people spend less, profits abate, maybe the stock market bubble bursts, and you extract inflation. And the great Milton Friedman, and I've said this on my social media a lot, El Presidente underscore EPM on Instagram, by the way, is the great Milton Friedman said only the government creates inflation by printing money or creating leverage. Period. So if one organization raises their price, that's not inflation, because if the money supply hasn't changed, sooner or later they'll stop selling the product because it's overpriced. That's what you might call transitory inflation. So what happened was there was so much money in the system in summer of '02 that was additionally printed beyond the original 4 trillion that kind of bailed us out of COVID, that because everyone spent this money instead of saving it, which was the intended consequence, or paying regular bills, rent, mortgage, all this money went into few people's hands, big corporations' hands. And so now you have this problem of we've got $7, $8 trillion extra in the money supply. And that's what I recommend. Go to St. Louis Fed, there's this part called Fred, and just look at the M2 money supply. And if you follow the M2 money supply, you will follow inflation and deflation, period. Why? Because if you have more money, you spend it frivolously. If you don't, you don't. And so now you have this situation where you have the coastal elites who've never given back their COVID money, have never given back the profits that they've made. You have Main Street America who spent it all and entered COVID half broke, exited COVID more broke. And there's this the wealth gap has never been wider. So consequently, you have this scenario whereby the Fed has kept rates persistently high because the data that we look at makes it seem like the economy is doing better than it is at large. While Main Street, Middle America is suffering. So what do I look at and what is sort of my prognosis? I don't love the Bureau of Labor Statistics so-called BLS reports, CPI, non-farm payroll. Why? Because they're mostly surveys and unreliable at that. So to me, and understand that the market may react counterintuitively. I'm not worried about the trajectory of interest rates. I'm worried about my assessment on the economy because I know if I'm right in the long run, I'll be right. I would prefer ADP over non-farm payroll, even though the market prefers non-farm payroll over ADP, for example. I prefer what used to be the Fed's measure of inflation, PCE, for example, over CPI. Also a survey. One of the little known things that's become more well known is a huge component of CPI is what's called shelter. Shelter is what you can imagine it is, the roof over your head. About 30% of shelter is an actual survey of homeowners that don't even rent their house. The question is, what would you rent your house for if you wanted to rent your house? Imagine us betting trillions of dollars on a question to somebody who's not even an expert on the subject matter or interest. Because I can tell you, what would I rent my house for? $1 million a month because I don't want to rent it.
Right.
So I look at that. And better than PCE, I look at ISM. ISM to me, whether it be manufacturing, non-manufacturing, are great indicators of where the economy is. I mean, it's sort of boots on the ground. You have price component, you have headline component, you have employment component. And so if you were to Google a chart of the correlation between CPI and ISM prices, you would see that generally speaking, historically, ISM front runs CPI. So that would give you a forward indicator. Do I think rates are going to go higher or lower? I've been on record in saying that I think rates are too high. But do I think that we're going to see 4% again? I think that it's highly unlikely. And what would prelude that would be a massive bust. And that's the dirty secret is that for us to get rid of this entrenched inflation, because again, another misunderstanding of where we sit today, we do not have out of control inflation. In fact, we have what would be considered disinflation. The rate of inflation is getting lower. Deflation would be negative inflation, whereby prices are dropping. Prices aren't dropping. They are growing at a slower pace. Which, why? Because we're not printing money at large. The only way we could have deflation, which is what we need to get prices back to where they were, is to have a bust. Period. We need money to come out of the money supply. And the only way you do that is with a housing bust or a stock market bust or both. And that's what the Fed does. That's the dirty secret. They create these booms by printing money, they create the busts by taking it out. It's just that simple.
You mentioned the Bureau of Labor Statistics and that they rely on surveys. And I mean, most people now aren't doing surveys. I mean, you're not getting, or the people that are doing them are the ones that probably aren't in the labor market themselves. They're probably retirees.
All problematic, 100%, right? It's I don't know if anybody's ever gone to Yelp. Okay.
Mm,
Half the restaurants they say stink are great, and half the restaurants that they say are great stink. And I think that if you learn something about humanity, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. I think that there's aspects of these surveys, the complainers are more likely to speak up, but then you have an ego. So think about this. If they send your business a survey to respond to, you're more likely to respond to it in a good month
right.
versus a bad month. There are other things like this survey. The reason why non-farm payroll, so non-farm payroll is revised really 12 times. You kind of only see three. Three are printed, but then you'll see an aggregate adjustment sort of a year later. And so, if those of you that might have saw, President Trump sort of pounded his chest on this one, as every administration always blames the previous. I mean, that's, famously when CEO gets fired, he writes a letter to the incoming CEO that says, this is the next person's fault. Leave this letter for when you go, right? Um, you blame the last guy and or gal, and so in this case, we had this massive million job revision, and from the previous administration, but that's not a political thing. It's we know that non-farm payroll is plus or minus 100,000 jobs, and so I want you to think about this. So sorry, the dog is. See, Max is also frustrated by the inconsistency in this data. Um, so non-farm payroll is plus or minus 100,000 jobs, margin of error. Okay, we need to create about 175,000 jobs to keep pace with a population growth. So if equilibrium is 175,000 jobs and 100,000 jobs is the margin of error, think about the calamity that ensues. If we print 175,000 jobs, we say, okay, we had an okay month. If that's revised down to 75,000 jobs, we had a terrible month. If it's revised up to 275,000 jobs, we had a phenomenal month. If it prints at 75,000 jobs, you'd say, not great, but not terrible. If that gets revised down to negative 25,000 jobs, people freak out. And same on the other side. If we print 225, slightly hot. What if that's revised up to 325? Holy cow, great month. It's preposterous. What I
Right.
always suggest, and again, different people have different motivations. Are you a trader? Are you in real estate? Are you in mortgages? Are you worried about the next loan? Are you worried about the next 48 months? What your agenda is, really, what your intended outcome is going to depend on how you look at these things and what you look at. But to me, what I've always done and what I always suggest is eyewitness economics. You go to your local store, ask questions. Is a really, really good chance that everybody else in the country is feeling the same thing. You go to a family barbecue, ask questions. How are things going? What's happening in your business? These are the things that when you look at, I've had the misfortune of going through what now? Six since 1988, six liquidity crises, I guess. And in every single one of them, my most successful years have correlated to the busts. And I think that the reason why is that I've always asked forget about the newspaper, forget about the internet, forget about the reports to some extent. They're information. How you process that information and put it in the context of what you're experiencing, I think is more significant than the actual data. And to me, that's real life. And I was asked 2013 taper tantrum at a barbecue, do you think that interest rates are going to go up for good? And there was, five or six buddies there, seven buddies, all college educated, all with families. So theoretically, people that were, you know, that needed to work, right? And needed to have ambition. And I went around and I said, who's better off today than they were in 2007? And not a one of them were able to say they were, except for one guy, Tim. And he said, well, I am, but because my wife is making more money than she's ever made, and I'm back to work, but I think I'm going to get laid off again. And sure enough, he did by December that year. So I said, well, how could rates go up if six people, seven people that fit a demographic that a healthy economy should be speaking to? You should be thriving in a healthy economy. If you're not, scratch beneath the surface, see what's really happening, regardless of the numbers. My answer to you is absolutely rates aren't going to go up. And they never did. And I'd say the opposite here, right? Has the supply chain been completely unstuck? Not really, right? Have we been able to take money out of the system? Not really. Trump tried to crash the stock market, didn't work. I mean, I can't prove this, but I'm telling you that that move in the spring was to try to temporarily crash the market because they know it's the only way to lower prices, period, is to burst the bubble. So I think it's hard, regardless of what these numbers are, to think that there's going to be any material and sustained relief until that money comes off the coasts, out of these few corporations and or elitists' hands and bank
Okay.
accounts.
So, so looking forward to September, what what do you think is going to happen? Uh, Everybody, I mean, I've heard like a quarter rate cut. I don't know. And then beyond that, what is your outlook for the Fed's rate path for the rest of 2025 and early into 2026?
So, yeah, I mean, look, I think a September cut is likely a foregone conclusion. We do have data coming up here. What I've also maintained is if there is a seasonality to interest rates, you could pull a chart for the last 20 years and almost no matter what's happening in the economy, here's what I could tell you, generally speaking, almost every year. Rates go up late September, mid October, couple week window until mid December. Rates go down from mid December till about mid February. Rates pop up mid February to mid March, April. Rates go down April, maybe May, pop back up June, July, drop. Summer is historically the best time for interest rates, July, August, September ish. Rinse, repeat. A lot of that has to do with just simply, again, common sense things. What happens in August or September? People get optimistic about Christmas, the holidays. If you're going to spend any money, of course you're spending it around the holidays. That's not an indication of how healthy the economy is or how much money you have in your pocket. Why might the job market be tight around, May, June, graduating, more people, more hiring, winter months, people buy, if you have a sustained winter, people have to go out and spend a little bit more money on their heat. What the Fed is trying to navigate is disposable income, ultimately. In the old economy, people spent what they had in their pocket. That's not the case in the new economy. We consume, okay? And so when you consume, that speaks less to your disposable income and more to the fact that you're in the matrix. And not to digress too much, but about 3 years ago, I was invited to a dinner with the head of the supply chain for Goldman Sachs. And what she said in all their analytics was she believed, well, first, they had some insight into knowing some of the natural resources, whether it be livestock, commodities, things like that. Like they know the date that we're going to run out of cows, essentially, right? Is what they're saying. So, ultimately, what she suggested that they believe is that we're going to go back to sort of the old way of living. Growing up, I don't want to date anybody, but I see that many of you are as old as I am, maybe a couple slightly older, right? Is we had one TV in our house. Or I had our second TV was a portable black and white TV that I put on a folding chair to watch a Yankee game while I was sleeping. Now you've got 20 disposable TVs in your house. So what she talked about was that we're going to go away from a consumptive economy to back more of quality versus quantity. And that is because we're running out of stuff and or kind of managing spending and folks' wallets and the fact that we're becoming less productive as a society. So I think that there are tremendous headwinds to lower interest rates. I think the huge tailwind is that um, more people are, I believe that most of the numbers, when you look at student debt, consumer debt, car debt, mortgage delinquency rising, all these delinquencies are at or near all time or cycle time highs. That's suggestive of the fact that, again, Main Street is hurting, but it's not coming out in the numbers, which is very dangerous.
Well, okay. So we have about 5 minutes left. So with that being said, everybody on this call presumably is in the mortgage industry in some capacity or another. What exactly should we be doing? Like should we be looking at like some specific economic indicators, some certain Fed signals? How should we be preparing for the next, I'm not even going to say 12 months, the next 6 months to 9 months?
Yeah, I think that along the lines of sort of keeping it real and taking it back to basics is just that. I think that interest rates don't care about how good or bad you are at your job. It's about how do you build successful businesses. It's not driven by price. We are so consumed by interest rates in this industry, and because we see that as our product. We are the product, right? And I think that but by going back to basics, by making the calls we need to make, by being competent, by having understanding what moves rates, but not relying on the movement of interest rates is a significant aspect to staying ahead of the curve. You know, I think that utilizing social media to a point is incredibly advantageous, getting people to understand who you are in the endeavor to make relationships. I think that having honest conversations with your borrowing base, with your prospective borrowers, and so forth, now's not the time, or now is the time. For example, I remember when I started as an LO in '89. I mean, we did consider ourselves consultants. Now, oftentimes we're just sort of compelled to quote a rate because somebody asks us to quote a rate, and I think that that's sort of problematic. What I would say is I think that another catalyst to success is sort of losing small and winning big. I think that if you prepare yourself for another 12 months of high interest rates and interest rates go lower, how do you lose? Right? Right?
Right.
But if you're prepared for higher rates, there's a really good chance that your competitors are not because they've just been hanging on by a thread. And that to me is what we're doing at EPM. And we've said we kind of hope that rates stay up here for a while. I mean, we still have some bad behavior in this industry that we think needs to be purged. I'm sure you guys have seen it on the front lines of promises that aren't kept, and the tails that you have to chase because of folks that are just hanging on. I think if we all just do a little bit better, that solves the rate. The rates are going to be the rates, and I got to tell you, if you look at some of the folks, there are some folks that are having tremendous success in this market, and I think it's just because they're controlling what they can control, and none of us are going to control the rates. The Fed can't even control the rates. What's the most likely outcome to go full circle, I think, on the first question? I think the Fed's going to likely cut rates in September, and I think there's a really good chance that when they do that, rates are going to move higher. And it's sort of that buy the rumor, sell the fact that happens in the markets. All the bets on the Fed cutting rates have already happened, right? So when you look at the market, there's a 91% chance that the Fed is going to cut right now, up from 88% pre Powell on Friday. So if they're saying that there's a 91% chance that the Fed's going to cut rates, of course they've already bet that. So we
Yeah.
only have a 9% delta to make up, right? If the data is bad next week or the week after, that 91 is going to go to 100. So you can only lose when the Fed cuts rates. Can only go down. Prices can only go down, rates can only go up. Unless, and there is a caveat to this, could the Fed cut 50? Could the Fed change their dots? Hard to be more dovish than just a cut. But for rates to go lower at this point after a cut, it would have to be a cut and dovish. If it's a cut and we'll see, if it's a cut and hawkish, if it's no cut, look out below because we got 91% bet that it's going to happen. So
Hmm.
what I always say is bulls and bears make money, pigs get slaughtered. What we're doing in our rate risk position, and that I would encourage any floaters, is the more likely we get to a rate cut, the closer we get to a rate cut, the shorter amount of time that you have on that next closing, because time is your friend when it comes to the markets. Like come next week, I'm not floating a September closing because you can when you're playing percentages, probability is what capital markets is about, not inevitability. The probability is you have more to lose than you have to gain at that Fed meeting because we're assuming the best already.
Right.
So I am defensive going into that meeting, but I haven't concluded that opinion yet because we've got a series of data to get through first. And I'm playing it day to day to there.
So this is just based off of everything you're saying. This is my last question. Is there anything that Trump can do or thinks he can do to achieve the outcome that he wants? And also, do tariffs have anything like, should we just not worry? I mean, obviously,
Yeah.
tariffs are going to cause the cost of goods to go up depending on whatever you're trying to buy. But
Yes.
should we just stop as far as from a mortgage perspective, interest rates? Just stop worrying about it. It seems like we should just like stop focusing on rate, just go
Yeah.
back to the fundamentals, focus on yourself, invest in yourself, and then you're going to be better for your customers.
Yeah. So not a political statement. we used to be able to talk about this stuff and be okay. Not anymore. First things first, to say, is there anything that Trump can do? That would imply that the president of the United States actually has the power to change any of this. My opinion, he doesn't. And they never have. We're not a democratic democracy. We are a republic. So ultimately, and we can go down a real rabbit hole here, we're voting on two people that they want us to vote on. That's the reality of it as I see it. Okay. The Federal Reserve isn't even a government agency, for goodness sakes, and they're deciding our fate. They're a bunch of banks that are part of a reserve infrastructure. So when you talk about all this stuff, what I recommend is scratching beneath the surface and really diving into what makes all of this tick. This is not a conspiracy theory, right? I'm not saying that you're going to uncover the Illuminati. But what I am saying is that there's a lot of stuff that I don't think that the average person realizes that moves things, that actually moves things. So I don't think that there's anything that he or any other president can do. What I will say is, like him or hate him, he is a businessman. And the office, for all intents and purposes, has never had a businessman in that seat. And business people do things differently than politicians. So if there's anybody that's ever going to get any movement, it is him, in my opinion. Or
Right.
the next person, man or woman, that comes from the business world that takes that seat. And I'll say this, I played golf about a month and a half ago with someone who is incredibly connected in politics. They ran the campaign for one of the candidates. Okay. And I could just tell you that I, I asked the question of, is that candidate disillusioned by everything that's gone on and people turning against this person and everything? And they're like, this is politics. And Washington kind of runs so deep that this is what it is. That's the political side of it. From an economics side, okay, tariffs do not create inflation. Full stop. You raising your rates into it, you taking your margin from 2 to 3 doesn't create inflation. Only the government creates inflation by printing money or creating leverage. And so, just to tie a bow on that, I will give you this example. If we all lived on an island and there was $1 between us, and we all had a business that we bought from, we all patronized each other's business, and I raised my price and got that price, that's what everyone would lead you to believe is inflation. And it is to an extent. It's transitory inflation. And why is it transitory? Because so long as we only have $1, there's only $1 to go around. So eventually, all of you would be broke enough that you wouldn't be able to pay me my price on my product anymore, which means that I'd lower my price, therefore lowering inflation. However, if we turned $1 into 3, and I raised my price and you didn't, there'd be 3 times the amount of money to pay my price, thus making it more sustainable. Now, if we then created a banking system whereby I would allow you to borrow 3 cents, $3 on the dollar, I'm even more likely to get my price, which would drive inflation even further. But then if we crash that and went from $1 to $3 to 50 cents in our money supply, and you can pull it's the M2 money supply is what you're looking for, right? 50 cents, I can't get my price if there's only 50 cents in our economy, and I'm probably broke too. And so my desperation from being broke would drive me to either go out of business, less competition, which would increase price, okay, or lower my price. It's that simple. The trick is that the Fed game of monetary policy, right, it's a shell game. It's there's no such thing as inflation or deflation because it's all driven by the money supply. The more money you have, the higher prices are going to be because there's more money in the supply because we don't value the money as much. If the money is scarcer, we value it more, we're less likely to spend it. It's that simple. And so tariffs will have a short-term effect because, yes, it does raise the price. It's going to create a distortion in the numbers that seem like inflation. Therefore, the markets will digest it as inflation. It's not the inflation that the Fed is theoretically trying to fight.
Okay. Well, with all
We're
that being
screwed.
said, there we go.
What about the mortgage business? We are broke globally. Here's, I'll send you down this rabbit hole. Go find out how much money we owe Japan. Japan owes the UK. Russia owes us. We all owe each other money.
Yep.
It's a Ponzi scheme. The whole thing is a Ponzi.
Yes.
Oops, sorry, someone's.
No, you can say yes. You can say yes because, right? We can't. You could argue that these independent and or the global economy has continues to have enough resources, natural or otherwise, to justify this leverage. However, it's becoming more difficult to come to that conclusion. When you consider just here domestically, our taxes at this point or soon doesn't even cover our debt. So how the hell do we fund the government?
Right. Well, I think that is the next big conversation, right? When our politicians come back from their break, they get to talk about figuring out if they're going to fund the government or if it's going to be, we're going to have a shutdown.
Yeah, it's crazy. The only way that I'll say this, the only way that you don't have to shrink the money supply is by growing the population, because you're talking about money in circulation per capita, but that'll take a long time. This could be a generational cycle. For example, if we stick at 25 or 24 trillion, whatever it is, right, and or we don't, globalize. I mean, one way to solve this is, I guess, is if we could take over, you know, some emerging countries that are broke or whatever, and add 300 million people. This whole I guess if we made Canada the 51st state, although they're not broke, but if we were to double the population overnight by taking over some broke countries, I guess we could spread the money out a little bit, and but that's kind of what we're trying to do with globalization. Yeah, I mean, I know we're out of time, but I'll say something that's really I found incredibly interesting. So I had a theory that rates were never going to go up, and and I was right for 40 years or whatever. But that theory around rates never going up was simply predicated on the fact that automation and information are anti-price. Okay, the internet and automation themselves is why we had 30 years of no inflation and therefore 30 years of low interest rates. It spurred competition and productivity, reduced wages, therefore reduced spending on a per capita basis. Massive deflationary vehicles. What I did not see coming, that's interesting, right, is that a huge catalyst to this localized accumulation of wealth in 5 companies, 100 individuals, was actually driven by the internet. So if you look at real estate, mostly luxury stuff, real estate, cars, watches, Xboxes and PlayStations, we've become a scalping society. And this started in COVID with hand sanitizer, toilet paper. What's
Mhm.
happening, part of what's keeping prices up is folks who have 100 million, 100 billion on the sidelines. They're getting into these cottage industries. So you could just go on Instagram and look at these watch dealers that are sitting on $100 million worth of watch inventory, but would suggest that the market's tight. The market's only tight because we've got watches sitting in vaults, right? Same can be said for cars. All the, you know, institutional buying of real estate. There's so much money in so few hands that they're cornering all of these markets, keep propping up prices. And some of the waterfall effect of the distribution of wealth, you have some people that are willing to pay it, you know? And so you don't need a lot of houses selling for 20, 30, 50, $100 million for a real estate market to look hot.
Right.
$100 million house is worth what? $4,000, $300,000 houses. And so that's sort of what you see. And I think that that's a highly problematic aspect of the quandary that we find ourselves in. And as a capitalist through and through, I want to make this clear. I'm not bitter or disillusioned by how wealth is distributed. But this is one that I think we'd love to have backsies on. Because I think this has gone a bit too far.
Well, on that note, we're gonna wrap this up. I really greatly appreciate you sharing this wealth of knowledge with us. Well, I'm definitely gonna have to have Jenna have you come back on in the future as things progress and get into 2026. So thank you very much for the folks that commented. Yes, this is recorded. It will be posted in NAM Hive later today. So thank you very much, Phil. Greatly appreciate it. Thank you to EPM, and hope everybody has.
Don't let any politicians see this.
Yes, I'll put a politician blocker on
I've
it.
already been audited. I don't need another one.
No worries. Neither I don't want one either. So, all right. Thank you. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.